Welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast, all about improving the lives of animals with better policies and practices in government and business. Brought to you by Animal Wellness Action, where we believe helping animals helps us all. Here's your host, Joseph Grove.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Animal Wellness Podcast. I'm Joseph Grove. Today, we're exploring a powerful idea that shapes how we see and treat other animals, the belief that humans stand apart from and above the rest of the living world. Often called human exceptionalism, this mindset underlies many of the animal welfare challenges we confront, from industrial agriculture to wildlife exploitation. It tells us that other animals matter less and that their lives can be used for our purposes. But what if that promise is wrong? And certainly that it is a no-brainer to all of us here at Animal Wellness Action, and it's not accepted by our guest today, who is Christine Webb. She is the author of The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. She is a primatologist and assistant professor of environmental studies at NYU, where she's part of the animal studies program. Her research examines the social, cognitive, and emotional lives of non-human primates, and her work bridges science and the humanities to rethink how we understand and assign moral value to other animals. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, and I'm sure several other places. Today, we're going to explore what a shift away from human exceptionalism could mean for animals and for us. Christine Webb, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start off with something very basic. Why this book and why now?
This book grew out of a seminar course I taught at Harvard for a number of years of the same name. And I was so inspired by the conversations I had with my students there about unlearning the myth of human exceptionalism and all of the ways in which it has infiltrated our culture, from our media and legal institutions to our language. And in my case, what I've been really interested in is how this myth has seeped into our sciences and often gets perpetuated under the pretense of scientific values like objectivity or parsimony or neutrality. And I was inspired because I saw how engaging with these ideas and learning to sort of see past the basic way our worldview has been framed by human exceptionalism changed my students' lives and their interests. Many of them went on to pursue careers in animal and environmental advocacy. And more than just their professional lives, their personal lives were transformed by the different kinds of relationship they felt they could have with all sorts of different forms of life than they were used to having relationships with. And so that is primarily what motivated me to write this book. And the question of why now, I think the students were very hungry for these ideas for a reason. We've known about the climate crisis for many decades, and it seems as if there's this general consensus that we understand what the problem is, but we just don't have the political will or, corporate values to implement the solutions that we need to implement. But I don't know that I agree with that, right? I don't know that we fully understood what the problem is, because if we had, perhaps we would have made greater headway. And it seems as if anything, things are going in the wrong direction. And so why now is that I really wanted to start questioning and thinking about the underlying worldview or belief system or story that makes all of these other exploitative systems possible, these systems that make it possible to exploit the environment and other animals.
You've compared it to a human superiority complex. Talk about what you mean by that.
Yeah, on the first day of class, I often ask my students, if we truly thought we were better than other species, why have human beings spent millennia driving home the point, right? And I'm drawing on this notion of a superiority complex in psychology, because it seems as if we're emphasizing our own capabilities and power to cope with deeper feelings of inadequacy and uncertainty, right? Psychologists have studied this tendency to flaunt your own abilities and intelligence and how that's actually related to deeper insecurities. And so that's what led me to the human superiority complex. And we see it, throughout Western history and into today, this notion that humans are smarter, more moral or virtuous, more capable, more evolutionarily advanced than other life forms. And that, of course, can be challenged on a number of ethical and scientific grounds.
Yeah, for sure. So that's interesting to me because I was prepared for, one level of answer on that. And certainly it's the obvious one that we believe many humans believe we are superior to other animals. But the notion that it may be a front or a posture for some latent feelings of inadequacy. I know you're not representing yourself here as a psychiatrist, but what do you suppose that compensation may be intended to compensate for?
Yeah, a good question. Our own animality, our own existence as mortal animal bodies and beings, they've actually done some interesting research on this in terror management theory. I don't know if you've heard of terror management theory, but this field of study that's looking at human awareness of our own mortality and how that guides and shapes so much of our decisions in our everyday lives, this knowledge and fear really that we're going to die, and how when we're reminded of our own animal natures, we're reminded of the fact that we're mortal beings, right? And I think that is one probably among many of these deeper insecurities that we hold, especially today, right? Where human technology is promising all manner of solutions to this problem of being an animal, whether it's that we can upload our consciousness or extend our lives by, several decades thanks to medications, right? It's very clear that there's an anxiety around this issue of aging and dying. And I think that's, one of the deeper senses of inadequacy we might have.
No, that's fascinating, and I wasn't prepared for the conversation to go down this particular avenue, but it's one perhaps we can travel together for a couple of minutes. I was reading a book, and I think it was the War of Art recently, or perhaps I don't know. I'm a grazer as a reader, but it was talking about how art. All art, for example, is another kind of response to the finitude of human life, right? That by making art, we strive for permanence in some way, and then perhaps put on a bit of the garb of the divine and the immortal, and then perhaps by saying we are so superior to all the other creatures, we again separate ourselves in some way where we escape a bit of that overarching, absolutely inescapable, ultimately, sense of mortality. That's fascinating. I wonder too what you would think about this, and that is, do we have to maintain the sense of superiority? Do we put it on like a shield to defend our psyches from the remorse, perhaps the guilt, the conviction that what we're doing to other animals is absolutely wrong?
I think that's a big piece of it as well, that there is a real cognitive and emotional dissonance that arises from treating sentient beings in such horrible ways and keeping them in such horrible conditions. And there's ways that we can resolve that dissonance, right? This is getting back to psychologists and theories that have been studied, the theory of cognitive dissonance. There's ways that we can remove the dissonance. One would be to stop engaging in those practices. And the other would be to rationalize or justify those practices on some grounds. And one of those grounds might be okay, well, other animals' lives, emotional, mental, cognitive experiences are not as complex and rich as our own. And therefore, we reserve the right. We are in some ways entitled to use them because there is a hierarchy here of who matters. And I think, unfortunately, right, that is the way of managing dissonance that many people feel compelled to choose.
Do people all over the world, in all cultures, have more or less a whiff of this human superiority complex? Or is it, as I might guess, predominantly found in the West? Are there Eastern cultures where the superiority is less, little better than complex rather than a superiority complex?
Yeah. Human exceptionalism is by no means a human universal. It's not a belief that all humans around the world hold. And while there are important cultural differences, it's also important to note that within every culture, there's so much internal variation. And that even if we look at something like Western culture, right, there's been a long tradition of human exceptionalism within Western culture, but there have also been many countercultures and traditions. Another way of looking at variation in this belief system or worldview is to look not just at the cross-cultural data, but at the developmental data. And fortunately, there have been a number of studies in developmental psychology in recent years that have put this question to the test. Do young children come into the world believing in human exceptionalism? Or is it something that they come to believe over time as they become enculturated, as they become a part of the main social fabric of their culture? And those studies indicate that it's the latter, right? Children don't come into the world prioritizing humans over other forms of life or believing that humans are better or smarter than other beings. There have been a number of studies that have shown this, but that as we enter adulthood, at least in Western industrialized societies, those beliefs in human primacy become more entrenched and lived.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. And if Wayne were here, he would know immediately, and you may know too, who said it. But teaching a child not to step on a caterpillar is as important for the child as it is the caterpillar. And I may have even mangled my recounting of that quote. So, which indicates that at some point, it's a healthful activity to educate children about the need for kindness and mercy, towards animals, which I suppose begs the question, where does the instinct to step on the caterpillar, let's say, or do whatever else a child might to animals come from? Christine, I'm going to dabble in something I'm not an expert on, but I do read a lot and I pay attention because of the work I do. But there are many people who would argue that the consumption of animals and the efficient protein ingestion that we were able to make by becoming carnivorous or at least omnivorous is part of what enabled us to thrive as a species, to evolve and get to where we are. And if that's true, and I suppose arguably, it is, it may be that the utilizing of animals and objectifying them and having this superiority complex is an adaptive trait. So just thinking of kids, I mean, are kids, out of the womb, beneficent regarding other creatures, and they learn the utilizing of them, or and then have to unlearn it? I don't know. It's a fascinating question, or maybe whether there's even a genetic trait, let's say, where the predisposition to kill animals and all of that comes about later than birth, or the young years. I've spewed out a bunch of stuff. I'm hoping it makes some sense to you and our listeners so that you can say something intelligent to them.
I'll do my best. I mean, so back to this point about stepping on caterpillars, right? And having to teach children not to do that and that being really important to them. I was just with a friend the other day and it rained a lot and there were a bunch of earthworms all over the driveway. And she was telling me that morning her daughter had burst into tears because their car was driving over all of these earthworms, right? And she couldn't handle it. And the mom said, well, that's just kind of how this goes. We got to get you to school and we can't go and pick up all of the earthworms and move them to the side. And she said, but why? Why can't we move all of the earthworms? What are you doing? You're killing them all and you're doing it knowingly, intentionally. And so from that example, I think, and there are many examples of this kind of spontaneous compassion that children have for other forms of life, even, creatures very different from us, like earthworms, that could lead one to reasonably conclude that, okay, there is this biophilia, right? This love and affinity for other forms of life that is innate. And it is something that we have from the time we are born. And then I think, curiosity that kids have for other animals might lead them to inadvertently harm them, right? Like when kids are stepping on caterpillars or like trying to hold them and handle them in ways that are actually not so gentle and delicate. I think a lot of that is inadvertent, right? That they're not trying to hurt these animals, but they're really curious to learn more. And I believe, gosh, we're talking a lot about psychology and psychiatry that maybe we're not equipped to talk about, but I believe that even, this
That's never stopped me before, okay. Christine. It's never stopped me before.
The desire to harm other animals from a young age, right? The desire to like pull off wings of flies and step on caterpillars would actually be a sign of a potential like disorder, like a sociopathology, right? That is actually one of the markers of that. So it's not actually, I do believe that kids come into the world already knowing, many kids, right, already know how to be around other animals because they are interested and they have respect for them. And then, zooming out to the broader course of human evolution and human history, you were questioning, whether there might be some kind of predisposition to kill other animals that is somehow adaptive, right? Because the protein intake led to the expansion of the human brain and our ability to think and behave in different kinds of ways. I just wanted to offer that in our evolutionary past, there have been many different ways of consuming other forms of life, including other animals. But those ways differ dramatically from the way that we consume other forms of life and animals today. And if we look at like hunter-gatherer populations, right, which is the vast majority of human evolutionary history, we were engaged in hunting and gathering. That practice actually required an immense amount of empathy for the other animal because you had to be able to think like they're thinking. Where are they going? Where do they normally spend their mornings this time? You actually had to, in many ethnographic accounts of hunting other animals from these indigenous societies, it was like they had to actually effectively become the animal in order to be able to pursue that animal effectively. And you contrast that with something like, what happened over 10,000 years ago during the agricultural revolution when we began domesticating other forms of life and they lived alongside of us. But I think it was a very different kind of relationship that developed. And some would even say, right, that because of that close proximity, we actually had to create more barriers between us and them when it came to empathizing with them and feeling for them, because otherwise it would be impossible for us to kill them when they're living really in human settlements and in such close proximity to us. And so I guess I just wanted to say, I don't have a solid answer to your question, but I just wanted to say that there's very different ways of killing other animals. And I'm not trying to say one is morally right and one is morally wrong necessarily, but that it troubles this idea that there would somehow be a kind of human universal adaptation to killing that would be passed down over so many generations, because human history is just so much more complicated than that. There's just so many different versions of human history and so many different ways of engaging with other animals.
Well, thank you for indulging my tangent there. I really appreciate it. It's a fascinating, subject. I mean, clearly biologically, we're not carnivores. We don't have the teeth for it, the eyesight for it, the digestive tract for it. So whatever we were, as we went down the Darwinian path, it was not originally the case that we thrived on other animals. And while we're talking about evolution, let's talk about the notion of continuity. And this is something that even before I got into animal welfare as a vocation, that I thought a lot about and talked with others about. And that is that the difference between us and non-human animals is really just a matter of degree, not of kind. And it's super fascinating for me to read about things that animals do that without some thinking, we might assume are only human. That animals grieve, that other animals are tool users. Octopuses opening jars. When I don't have a jar, can't open a jar, my wife will see if any of our friends have an octopus, so the octopus can open the jar. Bad joke. But, dolphins maintain long-term social bonds. Ryan, you'll have to do that. Start me over there. Dolphins maintain long-term social bonds. Rats will free other rats who are trapped, even when there's no reward. There are mirror self-recognition tests that many species have passed. Birds learn regional sign dialects, and I could go on. So talk about how in your book you address the subject of evolutionary continuity.
Sure. Yeah. And this famous phrase of Darwin, right, that differences between species are a matter of degree and not kind, has applied both to physical characteristics and to psychological characteristics. And I find it interesting that when it comes to physical characteristics, like our legs or our teeth or our eardrums, right, we tend not to balk at this notion of evolutionary continuity, that differences between species are a matter of degree and not kind. But when it comes to psychological characteristics, cognitive faculties, right, emotional faculties, like many of the ones that you just mentioned, there tends to be more resistance and hesitation, even though Darwin was very clear that this kind of evolutionary continuity occurs both at the physical and the psychological level. And in the book, I talk a lot about how when it comes to our evaluation of other animals' behaviors, often the simplest, most straightforward explanation is to assume evolutionary continuity. So I'm going to go on a little tangent here, but it has to do with my training as a scientist and learning about how talking about animals' emotional and cognitive worlds is a kind of anthropomorphism, right? That we're merely projecting human characteristics onto other animals. This stems from a version of the parsimony principle, where basically when we see an animal engaging in a particular behavior, we should always seek the simplest, most parsimonious explanation for that behavior. We shouldn't invoke an explanation that has all this additional baggage and noise. We should really try to find the most straightforward explanation for behavior, which is one of the reasons why this charge of anthropomorphism, it really became this like cardinal scientific sin. Like, don't do that because it's invoking all of these more complex mental explanations when perhaps we could just explain the behavior through instincts or genes alone. But what my mentor, Frans de Waal, offered to this debate and conversation, I think is so important, which is that actually, particularly when we're thinking about, our closest living primate relatives, other animals with whom we share so much already, isn't actually the most parsimonious explanation to assume evolutionary continuity so that a behavior that looks like it's grief or empathy or joy is actually grief or empathy or joy. That the simplest, most straightforward explanation is to assume evolutionary continuity in this mental characteristic that might be related or correlated with this behavior. And so he famously came up with this term anthropodenial, this opposite of anthropomorphism, right? Anthropodenial would be the tendency to deny similarities between humans and other animals when in fact it does exist. And so in the book, I explore a lot about that tendency to deny that similarity, again, in the name of certain scientific values, like being objective or not being anthropomorphic. But how there's other kinds of problems with that ethically and scientifically, even if we're just going back to sort of original Darwinian notions of evolutionary continuity.
And I find it interesting as a nuance that I hope I can articulate well enough to try and see it the other way, right? It seems to me like we spend a lot of times looking at animals and trying to see if what they're doing fits our paradigm, and perhaps not enough time to look at our own behaviors and try and see the animal instincts that drive them. And it's a weird anecdote, but it's the one that comes to mind on how to illustrate it. I was having a conversation with a friend many years ago, and we were talking about a female friend of hers who had broken up with a guy because, the guy didn't have, I guess, a certain amount of money or a job or whatnot. And her point was, my friend, she should just love the guy for the guy. Well, but that speaks to, I think, a denial there of our own animal instincts, if you will, to find mates who are suitable for us in particular environments, and that we somehow aggrandize ourselves by assuming there is, to our own motives, something far beyond that which may, in a slightly diminished form, motivate our furry friends.
Yeah, there's another word for this called anthropofabulation, which I agree with you, right? There's this tendency to seek human, quote unquote, human qualities in other animals. But what about noticing the quote unquote animal qualities within ourselves? And I mean, research has shown that, right, so much of human behavior is guided by subconscious processes, and that much of what we value in the world, right, like food and birth and relationships and all of these things, these are things that we have in common with other animals and other forms of life. And then, this idea of anthropofabulation, it actually came out of some work in philosophy that was looking at what standards do we hold other animals to when we're testing for their capacity. So like when we're looking for, okay, does another animal have episodic memory? Do they have memory for like specific situations and events? And we're comparing that to a human capacity for episodic memory. We're kind of making this assumption in the ways that we design studies to test for this ability in other animals that memory relies on conscious recall of past events. But we've shown that even in humans, right, memory does not necessarily rely on a conscious recall of past events. This is partly why there's so many problems in court cases with like false beliefs and false memories, right? We construct stories and narratives that are deeply unconscious and often not reflecting an accurate conscious image, of what happened in the past. And so it's just to say that I think you're right that we should be focusing on the arrow pointing right in either direction. I would just offer that, like, coming back to this notion of anthropomorphism, and I just did this exercise with my students in class today to illustrate, so maybe it's better. So I'll ask you a question. Do you like blueberries?
I do like blueberries.
I like blueberries too. Does that make you Christine-omorphic?
No.
No, right? So there's something about this word anthropomorphism that assumes that humans have a premium on that capacity and that that capacity is only derivatively not human. But how do we know which way the arrow points, right? So to say like human qualities in other animals or animal qualities in ourselves, what are these characteristics that we're deeming human and what are these characteristics that we're deeming animal? And I think there's a lot to say about that false divide and where it begins and sort of how it sets us up to make these faulty comparisons.
Well, I can't wait to tell my wife that this thing I've been thinking actually has a name, anthropofabulism. So she's going to be she's going to be super impressed, and I'm going to go a little higher, in her mate selection. She may keep me for a little while longer because of this. So I'm super excited about that.
But it's anthropofabulation.
Anthropofabulation. All right.
You're listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. We'll be right back after this quick word from our sponsor.
This is Wayne Pacelli with Animal Wellness Action. We depend on countless people like you to support our fight for animals. Join us today by donating to further our campaigns to spare countless animals from cruel and needless pharmaceutical tests. Put an end to animal fighting. Liberate farm animals from extreme confinement and so many others. Become a donor at any amount. Visit animalwellnessaction.org/donate to join our fight against animal cruelty of all kinds. That's animalwellnessaction.org/donate. Thank you.
Now, back to the Animal Wellness Podcast.
So you tell the story of the baboon bear who appeared to read your emotional state and respond. How did that moment reshape your understanding of animal cognition?
Sure. I had learned as a graduate student that one of the cognitive abilities that humans have that other animals don't is the capacity for theory of mind, kind of know what others know. And it's closely related to something like empathy, right? To kind of feel what others can feel. And my encounter with bear, which happened years ago in the Namib Desert, really challenged this assumption. So bear at the time was a young baboon. He was juvenile. And like many young male baboons, was causing a lot of turmoil, both within his own social group and with the human researchers following him. He was really testing many of his boundaries. This resulted in him climbing up our legs and trying to steal our equipment and slapping me on the back of my head one time. And it was frustrating, but never really got to a point that was scary, except for one day. A bunch of baboons, including bear, surrounded my colleague. I was in the field with her. They surrounded her. They were slapping her legs. They were barking. It was a very tense moment. It wasn't clear what started it, but that bear was involved and likely the instigator. And fortunately, nobody got hurt, but it was very scary for everybody. So much so that evening as a field team, we had a conversation about maybe we shouldn't follow this troop anymore. Maybe we should give it a break so that things don't escalate any further. Nonetheless, we decided that we would follow this same troop of baboons the next day, but we would do so at a much greater distance. And so the next day I was with bear's troop, keeping my distance, when over the ridge comes bear and an entourage of baboons. And this time they were coming directly for me. And I was in a very precarious position. I was kind of wobbling down this steep, rocky incline, and I couldn't easily move out of their way. So I just held very still, and I tried to remain as calm as possible. But deep down, I was terrified. I thought, okay, now it's my turn. Now they're going to come start a conflict with me. And they got closer and closer. And finally, bear got right up next to me, and he put his arm in between my hiking boots. And he looked up at me and he bared his teeth into an awkward, forced grimace. I remember it very clearly because his teeth were so white and they were so perfect and square. I had never seen baboon teeth that up close before. And I couldn't believe it because as a primatologist, I know that this is a pacifying gesture. This is something baboons do to avert conflicts and reconcile with one another. And so in that moment, I believe that Bear had to know, despite my best efforts to hide it, that I was afraid. And not just that, I believe he had to know what I knew about what had happened the day before. And he was trying to make amends for that. Again, this is a kind of theory of mind, the ability to know what others know. And I had learned that other animals weren't capable of this, but Bear not only showed theory of mind, he showed theory of mind for a member of another species, which is astounding. And it's a good example because I've had many examples of this throughout my career as a primatologist of having a particular assumption about what other animals are and are not capable of, and the animals themselves teaching me otherwise. It's not something I learn about in a textbook or right through conversations with other humans. It's the animals themselves showing me that I've been underestimating them.
Yeah, as I think we all do, and even those of us who love them and work for them, I think we still can not give them all the credit they deserve. So that's a fascinating story, and I'm so glad you shared it with me. It rings true, and I accept the premise you put behind it, that there was a real understanding of what you may be feeling or were feeling, and his desire to somehow palliate that. So I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and just to say one quick thing about this tendency to underestimate what other animals are capable of, even if we care about them so much and we're doing so much work on their behalf to help them, right? I think that just reflects the power of this worldview of human exceptionalism, that we've all inherited this, to some extent, this story about humans being separate and superior to other forms of life. And so despite our best efforts and intentions to escape it, right, we're all still performing it in some ways. And that's why we can sometimes be surprised at the amazing lessons that these other animals are continually teaching us that challenge these deep-rooted assumptions that sometimes we're not even fully conscious of.
How, and this is just another one of my personal thoughts, topics that interest me. And that is, what role do you see in religion and the instantiation of dominion as a component of that? Right. I'll just anecdotally share, I was talking to a friend a long time ago and, mentioned that perhaps, he doesn't need to eat, all the steaks he does, and he's, why not? Well, they suffer. And, and he said, well, that's why God put them here. Right. That they're somehow given a license. And of course, another way to look at it would be that, well, if we assume, as I do, that man created the religion, that perhaps that was built into the religion as a bit of evidence of one of your perspectives, right? Or one of mine, at least, that we somehow come up with these things to justify what we want to do. Do you see religion as an adversary in the propagation of the belief that animals deserve better than we're giving them?
I would say that the dominant reading of the Bible, right, and this passage in Genesis you're referring to, where man is given dominion over the earth and the seas and all the beings who inhabit them. I think the dominant reading of the Bible and this religious framework more generally is very anthropocentric. And at the same time, no religion is a monolith, right? And there's so many counter cultures within the Judeo-Christian tradition that are more ecocentric, right? More in line with this other way of understanding dominion that is not about power and control and mastery, but about care and stewardship, right? Again, a word that is a bit fraught and could have all sorts of different meanings depending on the context, but that is emphasizing a sort of responsibility to care for other forms of life. So I think I wouldn't blame religion, as an institution or as a way of knowing, but I would certainly blame certain strains and threads of religion, and particularly the dominant, reading of much of Judeo-Christian thought and texts. And then, I also think that human exceptionalism just tends to use the powerful institutions of its time, right? And at one point it was the church. And increasingly, arguably, today, many of us have come to trust science for explaining human beings and our place in the world. And I think that's one of the reasons why human exceptionalism has seeped into science. Science is now a powerful institution that is shaping the way we view ourselves in relation to other forms of life. And in a way that, perhaps religion once had a more prominent role than it does today.
Right. And, I'll point out for people who may perceive me to be being overly, critical that if you look at, the creation story, I mean, in the Edenic state, we did not eat animals, right? It was only after the fall, when we were in this fallen state, that we began, to use animals as things rather than other co-equal creatures, or creatures at least who share equally the earth. And then, if I'm recalling some of my New Testament learnings, after the second coming, and however you may describe that we'll return to a state where animals are no longer part of this utilitarian mix, which really says that there's an aspect of religion, if one cares to look for it and embody it or live it out, that a animal-free lifestyle, to cast it most broadly, is somewhat ideal within the terms of that particular belief system. And enough of that, because we're not philosophers, Christine, and we're not theologians, right? So we're going to let those people do that. Is it possible for science to completely shed its anthropocentric view? Can we come up with something that isn't influenced by our otherness in relationship to the rest of the biosphere?
To some extent, anthropocentric viewpoints is inevitable, right? We're human beings asking questions about the living world and in relationship with other forms of life who are very different from us. And so to some extent, we can't get past that. But I think we can do so much better than we're currently doing, right? The fact that we have a bias, and that to some extent that might be unavoidable, is not a reason to not try to do as good as we possibly can to both identify that bias, at least be forthcoming about it, and then to counter it in various ways. I think part of the issue in science with this worldview of human exceptionalism is that this comes back to my scientific training, and perhaps something that many people experienced in their own early, elementary education as scientists. It's like science is fact, and science is the truth with a capital T, and it is neutral and not influenced by cultural values and norms and ethics. It's something that operates in isolation from those things. When, of course, any historian or philosopher of science would tell you otherwise, that science is inevitably shaped by all sorts of cultural biases that we have. And we would actually do well to recognize those biases, be upfront about them, and then try to do work that challenges them. But part of the problem is that we often aren't even aware that they are playing a role in science, because we think that science is operating somehow in isolation from these ideologies and biases. So I think the big step at first is just to, and this is one of the things that happens with my students, right? It's just getting them to see that some of these things they took to be scientifically valid were actually influenced by human exceptionalism. And for them, that kind of, it's a very humbling realization, and one that opens their mind to a lot of other ways in which what they know needs to be reconsidered.
Fascinating. One final question as we're reaching the end of our time together. It's this. You argue that moving beyond human exceptionalism isn't just an obligation, but it's something we can gain from. What do we gain?
There's an amazing paper about arrogance, written by two philosophers, and why we should consider arrogance to be a moral vice. And they argue that arrogance impedes the pursuit of a good life for two main reasons. One is that it prevents the creation of true friendships. In that, if we're always pitting ourselves above or separate from other beings, we're not likely to form genuine, mutually trusting and enriching relationships, right? And of course, these philosophers were talking about human beings and human relationships, but I will extend it to thinking about the more than human world. So arrogance is a vice because it prevents us from establishing true friendships with others. And secondly, because it's through those friendships that we have a genuine understanding of ourselves, what I believe Aristotle called a mirror onto the soul. Friendships are a way of truly understanding ourselves as reflections, our reflection in other people's eyes. And it's through those relationships that we really get a genuine understanding of ourselves. And they're talking about human to human relationships, but I'm so interested in expanding this logic out to consider how humans relate to other forms of life. And through this kind of arrogant posture, right, of human exceptionalism, where we're separating ourselves out from other animals and the environment more generally, we're preventing the establishment of genuine friendships, of genuine relationships that are based on mutual enrichment and trust and love and benefits, right? And not only that, right? And I think that's in and of itself that's so important, right? I mean, we're living in a time of what people call species loneliness, right? Loneliness is an epidemic. And imagine if we could just get over this notion that we're separate and superior, then we could have friendships with like all different kinds of beings, not just human beings. And then through those kinds of relationships, not just with other humans, but with radically different forms of life, don't we gain an even more nuanced and interesting perspective on ourselves because we're having such radical diversity through which to really understand ourselves, so many different kinds of relationships that can be mirrors onto the soul. And so that is one of the reasons I believe we're also selling ourselves short in having this worldview of human exceptionalism. And there are others as well, but I will stop there.
Right. Well, no, that's plenty to think about and very well said. Christine Webb, author of The Arrogant Ape, The Myth of Human Exceptionalism and Why It Matters. Where can people find your book, Christine, and where can they go to learn more about you and follow you and keep up with your pursuits?
Yeah, the book is available anywhere books are sold, and you can check my personal website for information about the book and future events that I'll be doing about the book. The website, I'm sure you'll link it, but it's just ceweb.com.
Thank you for listening to the Animal Wellness Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and follow Animal Wellness Action on Facebook, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. To stay current with all of our news and information and to take action to help animals, sign up at animalwellnessaction.org. Until next time, remember, helping animals helps us all.